Welcome to Qualified Opinions, where we test the ideas and limits, the knowns and known unknowns around freedom and order in contemporary politics and society. We invite you to listen as we engage with leading and emerging thinkers across disciplines and issues who will sharpen our thinking on the topics shaping our discourse. Welcome back. On Saturday, February 1st, President Donald Trump imposed 25% tariffs on all goods imported into the United States from Canada and Mexico. Mexico and Canada turned around and retaliated with their own tariffs. And then on Monday, Mexico and the U.S. announced that they have reached a deal and paused the tariffs war for a month. Tariffs are a tax on imports, so I wanted to talk to an economist who is a specialist of both taxes and tariffs. And that person is Erica York of the Tax Foundation. Welcome, Erica.
Thanks, Vero.
So before we start, I want you to tell me about how did you get to do what you do at the Tax Foundation?
Yeah, so my interest in economics actually started with a high school history and economics teacher, got me onto the subject. So that's what I majored in college. And then I happened upon tax policy because I am from the state of Kansas, and our governor very famously did a tax experiment, an attempt to reform the tax code that kind of went a little bit haywire. And so that got me really interested in tax policy and in Tax Foundation. I got to intern there in summer when I was in grad school working on my master's, and then got to start at TF after I graduated.
And so can you tell us, what do you do? So what does the Tax Foundation do? It's a think tank. I don't know if you actually call your guys a think tank, but it's a think tank. But you guys do policy, but you do it in a very specific way.
Yeah, so we're a think tank. We're a 501c3 nonprofit, and we're focused entirely on tax policy. We've got centers at TF that focus on state, federal, and global tax policy. I'm part of our federal team, and we've got an in-house macroeconomic model, which lets us estimate the revenue, the distributional, and the economic impact of changes in federal tax policy. And we approach taxes from a principled standpoint. So we think they should be simple, neutral, transparent, and stable. And we combine that with our economic model to evaluate proposals to the tax code.
That's great. So let's talk taxes. So, the news on taxes, it's hard to keep up with. This weekend was like insane. Okay, tariffs against Canada and Mexico. Oops, retaliation from Mexico and Canada. Oops, plan that to lift the tariffs or pause the tariff with Mexico for 30 days. A lot of the argument flying around about why the president wants to do tariffs. It's ethanol, it's wood coming from Canada, it's unfairness all around. It's all sorts of things, and then we are going to get revenue. So let's get down with the basic. You wrote a fantastic piece at the Cato Institute for their globalization project called Separating Tariffs Facts from Tariff Fictions. So what are tariffs?
Yeah, tariffs are a type of tax. They are an excise tax that are applied to goods that we purchase from companies in foreign countries. So they act like a sales tax at the border. If you want to bring a good into the United States, you have to pay a tax to the U.S. government in order to do that.
So are they... There's a schedule, right? Where if someone wanted to see all the tariffs that we have with other countries, where would one go?
Yeah, there's a cool database, USITC data web, where you can see how much we import, how much customs duties have been collected on those imports by country. That's where you can see the schedule. It's got chapters. You look up the specific type of good. It gets super detailed. We've got different rates that apply to different things. And that's where you find out what the tariff schedule is. And
historically, we've always had tariffs. Right. And one of the things that modern protectionists like to talk about, and you talk about this in your piece, is the fact that we used to rely exclusively on tariffs, for actually not exclusively, but mostly on tariffs to raise revenue. And now we don't, because we have the income tax. And at the time, the economy was growing, and we should do that again. We should use tariff to restrict goods from coming in, and yet replace the income tax with tariffs. What's wrong with that picture?
A couple of things. So if you look at why we used tariffs as one of the main revenue sources, it was ease of collection. If you think about the 1700s and 1800s, the economy was very different. It's a lot easier to collect revenue at ports of entry where there are only a few, where you can have tight control over what's coming in and you can very easily assess the tax. It's a lot harder to have an income tax. We didn't develop the income tax system and withholding until the 1900s. So it's just a difference in ease of administration is why that was the first and the most obvious revenue source for a new country. And then if you also look at the size and scope of federal government, when tariffs were a primary source of revenue, federal government spending as a share of the economy never exceeded 5% of GDP. It was closer to 2 to 3% of GDP. That's how much we pay on interest on the debt now. Our total government spending as a share of GDP is much larger, and taxes on imports just mechanically cannot finance that. Even if we want to make an argument about shrinking the size and scope of federal government, you really couldn't even sustain payments on the debt with tariff revenue. So it's just a non-starter to try to do this math problem of, hey, we're going to get rid of the income tax, we're going to balance the budget, and we're going to do it by taxing imports. That's before we even get into the question of, should we want to do that economically?
Yeah, well, and then the other thing is, I guess you can't do both, right? You can't have really restrictive tariffs that are meant to stop things from coming in and raise a lot of revenue. You just can't have it both ways.
Yeah. If you look at how we've used tariffs throughout history, Doug Irwin has an excellent book on this, and he puts U.S. tariff policy into three phases. Revenue. The main goal is to keep imports flowing in, so you have a tax base where you can earn revenue and pay for government spending. Restriction, where the goal becomes we don't want imports to flow in. We want to stop that, so we can create a protected domestic market for manufacturers, for businesses here, so that there isn't import competition. If there's not an import flowing in, there's no tax base to collect revenue on. So you run into this contradiction. And that's kind of some of the contradiction we're seeing with what the Trump administration today is talking about. Is this a negotiation tool? Is this a protection tool? Is this a revenue tool? You have to choose one. You can't have it always.
Yes. So let's talk about goals. Let's list all the different things that modern protectionists claim they can achieve with tariffs. So raising revenue is one of them. It's a tool for negotiation. It's another one. It's restrictive. It's to restrict imports. What is it? Balanced trade. So what's your sense, having studied this issue, about the ability of tariffs to actually achieve their goals?
They really don't achieve those goals. Let's take growing the manufacturing base. If we look at what it is we import, more than half of imports are inputs or capital goods that contribute to the production process here in the United States. So we've got this really interconnected global supply chain where we rely on suppliers across the world, and where if you look at who U.S. importers are, they're also U.S. exporters. So our biggest companies that are importing these inputs and these machines that they use to go on and produce something here in the U.S. and export it. So if you place a tax on that, you're really increasing the cost of production in the United States, and you're creating a competitive disadvantage for locating your production here, because if you located it in another country, you wouldn't have to pay that tax on your input. So you may be able to protect one industry, say steel producers, but you do so at the expense of all the downstream industries that use that in their manufacturing process.
It's interesting that you said that. I just finished writing a piece about the history of steel protection in the U.S. Obviously, I relied a lot on Doug Irwin's book, but and it was kind of a much bigger apple to bite, or whatever the expression is, because it started literally with the history of the nation, right? It's like protection of steel tariffs, and it has not been really good for the steel industry.
No, and that's like another thing. If you put protection in place, if you create this protected domestic market to sell into, you're removing these forces that lead to innovation and that lead to higher capital expenditure. You're saying, no, you don't have to make these investments in order to be profitable. We're going to put up a barrier so that you can just be profitable with the status quo. And so in the long run, you don't get higher capex, you don't get more innovation, you get slower companies. You get companies that are fine sitting back and enjoying their profits and lobbying for more protection and for protection for a longer period. And so again, you don't see tariffs leading to these outcomes that modern protectionists say they want, which is a revival of the manufacturing sector, an increase in investment spending overall, an increase in productivity overall. Those don't pan out.
And steel may be one of those places where you can actually do a lot of the manufacturing without relying too much. Even though it's steel for this, you still have to rely a ton on imports. But so much of what is imported is our inputs, but also enormous amount of the trade people don't realize is trade between related parties. So it means it's like American companies with subsidiaries abroad who want to keep for the homogeneity of their products, they actually import stuff from the US or from wherever that is produced for every plant around the world for this American company. And it crosses the border a bunch of times. And we're just I think it's a majority of trade that happens. And the biggest importers are the biggest exporters. And this notion that you could actually, put a little bubble around manufacturing and they'll thrive is just, crazy. What about in your paper? You look at the impact on trade deficits, because that's a big thing with Trump. He hates trade deficits.
Yeah, he's very focused on them and misunderstands them. So if you look at what drives the US trade deficit, it's not a story of trade policy. It's not a story of tariffs. It's a bigger macro story about the imbalance between domestic saving and domestic investment. We don't save enough to fulfill all of the investment opportunities available in the United States. A big part of that is, of course, the federal government runs a massive budget deficit year after year. And so to make up for that, we have an inflow of capital from the rest of the world. Foreigners directly invest in US companies, they buy US treasuries, they fund these investment opportunities that otherwise wouldn't happen. So if you look at the trade deficit, it's mirrored with a capital account surplus, an inflow of investment coming into the United States. And the only way that you shrink the trade deficit is to shrink this gap between domestic saving and investment. And so you'd need to increase saving or shrink investment. We wouldn't want to shrink investment. That would reduce the size of our economy, reduce how much we could produce in the future. And so really what needs to happen is a reduction in the federal budget deficit. That's what, lawmakers have the ability to control. That's not achieved by placing tariffs on imports. We would not expect to see a big shift in the trade deficit from tariffs. The immediate thought that someone might have is, well, if you place a tax on imports, you get less imports. Therefore, the trade balance, quote unquote, improves. But that misses the full circle of what happens when you put a tax on imports. Yes, imports fall. That means the global supply of dollars falls as well. We are not needing to exchange our currency to buy goods that are denominated in foreign currencies. That leads to a stronger US dollar. That means that part of the burden of tariffs falls on exporters, because when the dollar gets stronger, that makes US produced goods more expensive on world markets. So our exports fall. That's why in economics, it's called the Lerner symmetry theorem. A tax on imports is economically equivalent to a tax on exports. So when you impose tariffs, you're not actually fundamentally changing the balance of trade. You'll shrink how much we trade overall, but you're not going to budge the trade deficit.
what about if you put a tax, if you put an import tax on China? Because that's China is one of the reasons, less so this time around, actually, interestingly enough.
Yeah.
We're going after Canada and Mexico and our friends, and probably the European Union at some point for having a VAT. Who knows? But not so much China. I mean, it's interesting. But let's say we put 25% or like 50% tax tariff on China. Sure, our trade with China may go down, but what else could happen?
Yeah, we'll see that flow and be displaced to trade with other countries. And that's what happened in 2018, 2019. You can absolutely move around like bilateral trade flows. If we import less from China, that's what happened in the first Trump trade war. We imported more from other Asian countries. We imported more from Mexico. So the overall balance of trade, no fundamental change. The pattern of how that occurs across countries, that can be influenced by trade policy.
Yeah, so basically, you can reduce our trade with China, but overall, you're not going to really affect our overall trade deficit.
Yep.
You know what is actually really not easy, but an effective way to reduce the trade deficit? A good recession. Like a good recession, right?
That'll do it.
That will do it. And that's probably the only real way to go about it. It's just like enormous war. I mean, it's just like each time I think about this argument about the trade deficit, I'm always thinking the only ways to really reduce the trade deficits are horrible ways. Why would anyone care? And I know it's been said many times, but people don't care about the trade deficit that Virginia had. First, it's not Virginia. It's like people are trading. Countries are not trading. It's like people within countries that are trading. But also, I mean, I have a trade deficit when I go to Whole Foods or wherever to buy, and no one cares about this. It's just this obsession with the trade deficit is weird.
Right. And I think it shows how silly it is when Trump says if Canada became the 51st state, this would all be fine. Well,
that's true.
Then it's fine now.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
That's a very good point. Yeah, I didn't even think about that. Yeah, if it's fine when it's so bizarre. But let's talk about actually who's actually shouldering the cost of tariffs, right? You have a really useful again, I really recommend this piece at Cato. And in fact, I have to tell Scott, it's not that easy to find it if you don't actually just Google your name with the name of the piece. Like going through and finding pieces through their website, it's not that easy. So I'll put a complaint out there for Scott, but Lincecum. So you have a really great, I guess, what is it called? A chart flow in there
chart.
that explains. So can you kind of give us the gist of it? So who shoulders what in which circumstances?
Yeah. So Scott and I worked on this together, and it walks through who pays the tariff and who bears the economic burden. So one of the first questions is how much is passed through to domestic import prices. Legally, when we put a tax on imports, it's the importer who pays. Theoretically, the foreign producer could lower their price in the face of a tariff to bear some of that. So instead of a good that used to be $1 facing a 10% tax, maybe they lower their price to 98 cents. So they bear 2 cents of the burden. We didn't really see that happen in 2018, 2019. We saw import prices remain the same, which implied that the tariffs almost completely passed through to the U.S. economy. So if we're in that world, they're passed through to the U.S. economy, then there are still a couple of questions on who's going to bear the burden. It could stick with that importing firm. Maybe they don't have the ability to raise their prices for their downstream consumers. So the effect of the tariff is that it reduces that business's revenue, which means they have less to compensate their workers. They have less to compensate their investors. The ultimate outcome of that is that after-tax incomes shrink because of the tariff burden. Maybe they do have some power to pass those prices on to their final consumers. So the prices on the retail store shelf increase by the amount of the tariff. In that case, then final consumers have to pay more for the tariffed goods. They have less to spend elsewhere, so demand elsewhere in the economy falls. Other businesses lose out on revenue. When they lose out on revenue, they have less to pay their workers and shareholders. So the upshot is after-tax incomes fall. Whether we're in this kind of pass back to business revenue, pass forward to consumer prices, the ultimate effect is that tariffs reduce the after-tax value of income in the US economy. Even if we're in a world where, like, let's say currency appreciation offsets some of the burden on import prices, then we're in a world where exporters bear some of the burden because then they lose out on export sales, they lose out on incomes, so incomes fall that way. And same too, if you think of the foreigners bearing some of the burden, their incomes are lower. That could come back to bite us if they then turn around and purchase fewer US exports. So there's no way for tariffs to be free. And even in the case where tariffs are fully passed through to the US economy, that doesn't mean our trading partner goes unharmed. When we have to pay higher prices for imported goods, we buy fewer of them. So export incomes in that foreign country fall too. So both economies are harmed.
What about the distributional effect of tariffs?
Yeah, tariffs tend to have a regressive burden. So they create a larger tax increase on lower and middle income households than they do higher income households. And this is just a function of consumption patterns. If you think of a lower income household and how much of their income they have to spend, especially how much they spend on traded goods, they don't have much left over to save, if any. A higher income household can finance its consumption and then have some money left over for saving. So as a share of income, more income for lower and middle income consumers gets hit by the tax created by tariffs than it does for higher income households. So that's why as a percentage of after-tax income, you tend to see a smaller effect on the top quintile, the top 1% than you do on lower income taxpayers.
Are you telling me that this populist policy is actually hurting the people that the populists are trying to prop up?
Indeed, it has a harsher impact on working class Americans than it does on the wealthy.
Yeah, and we have a lot of evidence actually looking at the reverse, which is the steady decline in tariffs, in the burden of tariffs the last 70 years, and the impact it had on lower income Americans has been actually quite very well studied and quite impressive. So and I guess even someone like Oren Cass recognizes it because he keeps railing that the problem is that we valued consumers and cheap TVs as opposed to whatever else we were supposed to value. So that's kind of an implicit. It's admitting that, yeah, they bring down prices. Talking about prices, what's your take on tariff and inflation?
Yeah, I think the way that the layperson uses inflation means prices are higher. They don't care about the technical reason why and whether it has to do with monetary policy or not. And I think the point that gets lost is that tariffs make us poorer. And tariffs do that by increasing the tax burden. They increase the relative prices of tariffed goods. So if we have to pay a 25% tax on all, footwear, that means footwear becomes that much more expensive in the US economy. Our dollar does not go as far. The way that tariffs could lead to an increase in the price level, there's a really great paper by Alan Viard that talks about different types of tax increases and how they could or could not affect monetary policy and thus affect the price level. So what would happen with a large, sudden increase in tariffs? Like say we did, universal tariffs on everything, really high rate, all of a sudden, all overnight, it takes effect. That would create a massive shock to the labor market. The stuff that we produce, there would be a wedge between the value of that and the after-tax value of it. And essentially the pressure that businesses would face would be to decrease wages. But we know wages are sticky. And so firms don't have the ability to do that. So instead of being able to lower wages, given this new big tax burden, there would be pressure to lay off workers. Mm-hmm. When unemployment increases, the Federal Reserve's dual mandate kicks in. They don't like to see unemployment. So they would respond by loosening monetary policy and accommodating that. So instead of getting massive layoffs, we would get a one-time increase in the price level. And that would lead to restoring equilibrium in the labor market by allowing inflation to take place, nominal wages staying the same, so in real terms they fall. So that's the mechanism by which we could see
By the
the
way,
Federal Reserve
regressive,
react.
again, another regressive policy, right?
Exactly. And whether it's big enough to require that Federal Reserve accommodation or not, it doesn't actually change the distribution of the burden. It doesn't change the real burden. It just changes our short-term transition getting to this new economy with a tariff. Either way, whether we see inflation or not, the effect of tariffs is to shrink outputs, to shrink the after-tax value of our incomes. So I think the debate about is this inflation? Are we going to see something change in CPI? Kind of misses the point.
Yeah.
Tariffs are going to make us poorer no matter what the transition to that new poorer level is.
There's one argument actually that I don't hear made often that I think is valid with respect to inflation. And that is that high tariffs, especially the kind that you describe, would slow the economy. And effectively slowing down the economy makes the fight against inflation harder. And it's basically, it's going to make, considering we have inflation right now, the last thing you want to do is to do anything that actually slows down the economy. Because you can, especially when you have, you have such, just fighting inflation with higher rates is dangerous without doing any fiscal adjustment, because the higher rate leads to higher income interest payments, which are leads to more debt, and all of this doesn't even reduce aggregate demand. But the tariffs will slow down the economy, right? And if we had more growth, that we helping fighting inflation. All of this is just basically it's slowing down, or it's making it more difficult to fight inflation.
Yeah, it does nothing to help on that front. And I think another angle that people talk about is kind of the long run angle of, what we see with tariffs is a reduction in productivity and a reduction in competition. So not necessarily like an exact inflationary angle, but what we see with competition and increased productivity is, prices fall over time. If we're cutting off some of the mechanisms by which that occur, then we're kind of cutting off that trend as well.
So what about you have a section on the impact on innovation? What's the impact of tariffs on our ability to innovate? I guess it's tied to economic growth and all this.
Yeah, that's tied to the competitive pressures that we face. And so if you think about the incentives that are created when you say, the way that you get to earn higher profits, it's not through finding a better way to serve your customers or finding a smarter way to set up your factory or investing in the latest technology or capital. It's you get to enjoy higher profits because we're placing a tax on your competition. That dulls these forces that lead to innovation over time. And we've got, studies of past episodes of tariffs that look at this and find that labor productivity is lower when tariffs are in place and it rises when tariffs go away. Part of that is because of the competitive forces that are introduced when you remove these barriers to import competition. Part of it also is the incentives to lobby. So if you look at, there's quite a few studies on steel tariffs that have looked at this. What do these firms use their higher profits for? Are they really investing and trying to become more innovative? Or are they just rewarding their shareholders and lobbying the government? It's the latter. Those extra profits are plowed into ensuring that protection remains rather than plowed into ensuring they become a more nimble company. So the long term, if the goal is improving our industrial base, encouraging innovation, encouraging technological development, tariffs aren't really the incentive system to do that.
Yeah, and when you look at the steel tariffs, the extent to which these guys, like the consumer of steel, went to get exemption from the steel tariffs, it was crazy because it was a bidding war, and it was lobbying up the wazoo, resources that would have been better invested in their firm, in their company, in their workers, in what have you. It was honestly politically unseemly, morally questionable, and it's just an enormous waste of resources. And it's and they were distributing exemption like to basically their political friends. I saw a study that actually showed like they looked at the number of time people that actually kind of either contributed to campaign or gone to the White House, and so we criticized that. That's an argument we were making at the time when President Obama was in office, distributing green energy grants with Solyndra, visiting the White House an enormous amount of time. Solyndra was a solar company that couldn't get access to capital because it didn't have a good business model, but with relationship to the White House, managed to get a 1705 loan guarantee that, and then when bust, costing taxpayers a fair amount of money in the end. But the same is true with tariffs. It's the same thing.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, there were studies of the 2018-2019 tariffs showing that if you had donated to the Republican Party, you were more likely to get an exemption than if you had donated to the opposition. And that's no way to handle an exemption process. And I mean, even that an exemption process exists in the first place, I think is evidence that this is a harmful policy. It causes pain for U.S. businesses. If it was free, if it was paid by the other country, then why would we need to exempt anyone from the tariffs?
By the way, you're the perfect person to ask this, even though it takes us a little out of the route, but I hope people will forgive me, because today for lunch, I was talking with one of my colleagues. We were talking about the AB5, the contractor rule in California. And it was basically, they wanted contractors to become regular workers, whatever, blah, blah, blah. And in the course of that conversation, they were talking, my colleagues was talking about how they were granting all these exemptions to all these industries. And I was like, well, then who is left, right? Who is left? And we were talking about, that made me think about the income tax. There used to be a time where the income tax was enormous. It was, the rate was really high. But one of the reasons why that was possible was because they had carved out the tax code so much that basically few people were actually paying that top marginal rate of 90% or whatever percent. And I kind of it makes me wonder whether this is actually a rule number one of the political economy, which is effectively you can have very, very, very punishing rules only if you have enormous exemption, which is really actually so much worse, right, than a system where you actually have, this enormously punishing rate, no exemption, because then you can let the system and the people fight to remove the thing. But I don't know that we only get, unfortunately, with the incentives within government, that's what we always get. You get the high rate with massive carve-outs.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, that puts the government in a position of power, because then they get to choose, who is subject to this, who is not, and they get to, deal out favors to political allies. And that's one of the things that seems so crazy to me about just the executive authority that's been granted to the president to set this level of tax policy and essentially, set the tax rate by company. That's what we saw with the 2018-2019 tariffs. And it's what we could potentially see this time around. And, one would hope that Congress would say, hey, we're going to pull some of this authority back. I don't think we're in that world yet. But, maybe if we actually touch the stove and it gets bad enough, Congress will rethink how much leeway they have given to the president to be able to do this.
Yeah. I mean, it's the corruption that goes behind giving so much power, or even implementing a policy that has such high rates or is punishing by design, right? Means that inevitably special interests are going to come and lobby you, and with the power that is granted to politicians, they're going to carve out the stuff, and it's just I'm sorry, I just think it's utterly disgusting personally. But you're more optimistic than I am about Congress's willingness to actually take some of that power back. I mean, think about it this way. I mean, when the Democrats were in power, they knew Trump was coming back, and yet they did nothing to take that power back. And I don't know. I'm concerned. I'm concerned about it. And to be completely fair, I mean, there's a case to be made for why the powers were delegated in the first place, right? I mean, and it was one where the assumption, and it was true, right, to negotiate trade deals by the president meant that the president wasn't subjected to all these special interest, local pressures, and it was actually thinking about the well-being of the country. But this is not what we have now.
No, the case has changed. Yeah.
So let's talk about what we could do instead of tariffs. I mean, honestly, we could do nothing and we'd be better off than having tariffs. But there are things that we could do to achieve some of what the president wants to achieve. Let's talk about manufacturing and the pressure with China. You have a piece that actually compares the tax system in China versus the American tax system. And so can you tell us what are the main difference and how is that penalizing us?
Mm-hmm. So our headline corporate tax rate at the federal level is 21%, but most states levy their own. And so if you look at the combined average of state and federal corporate taxes, our combined tax rate is actually higher than China's 25% headline corporate tax rate. So there we don't have a competitive advantage on rate. And more importantly, we've also got a number of policies in the business tax base that directly place a tax on business investment and on R&D activity. So if you look at the deductions we have for when a company spends on research and development, they don't get to take that deduction in year one. They have to amortize that over 5 years or 15 years. And like we all know that $1 in the future is not worth as much as $1 today, both because of inflation and because of the opportunity cost of what you could be doing with that dollar if you had it. So we don't fully let firms deduct their research and development costs. Meanwhile, China has a 200% super deduction. So you get to deduct double what you spend. That's a big subsidy. I'm not saying we need a big subsidy, but we should at least not bias our tax code against that.
So that's for R&D.
That's for R&D.
What about full expensing?
Yeah. So for capital investment, we kind of see a similar story play out. The Chinese tax system has depreciation schedules that run from a couple of years to 20 years long. Ours run from a couple of years to 39 years long. So we particularly penalize investment in structures like factories, warehouses, manufacturing facilities. Those have to be deducted over almost 4 decades, which significantly increases the cost of capital for structures investment. Same with machinery and equipment. The 2017 tax law temporarily permitted a 100% deduction for that, but that's been phasing out and it will fully phase out after the end of 2026.
So it started phasing out in 2023 and it will,
Yeah. So it drops off by 20 percentage points a year and will eventually get to no bonus. So you'll have to deduct it over time. All of that increases the cost of capital, and it's also really complex. If you look at the time spent complying with depreciation and amortization forms, that's one of the largest time sinks in the corporate tax system. So not only are we penalizing capital investment, we're also making you spend a long time complying with it and wasting resources on tax accountants to, track depreciation and all of that. So you'd get a simplification benefit and you would eliminate that tax burden on marginal investment if you allowed just full and immediate expensing. We've modeled that at Tax Foundation, and we find that is one of the most economically efficient tax cuts in terms of bang for the buck, the GDP growth you get for the revenue that you give up. It's extremely powerful, which makes it a really fiscally responsible reform and just like an economically common sense reform. It would disproportionately benefit the manufacturing sector. It would disproportionately benefit capital intensive sectors because they are disproportionately penalized in the tax code right now, given their current treatment. So it would make the tax code neutral, but provide a big benefit to manufacturing.
It would really be, it would be killing 2 birds with 1 stone. Because when the president says, if you come and produce in the US, you're going to pay low taxes. But then if you produce abroad, blah, blah, blah. Full expensing only benefits companies that are producing here, right?
Yeah, you only get this deduction if you're making an investment in the United States.
Exactly. And it really would benefit manufacturing or like capital intensive investment. And so, for instance, for semiconductor, for instance,
Mm-hmm.
right? I mean, that would be the kind of the thing that would definitely benefit from full expensing. I mean, that's one of the things I'm curious of what you think, how you think about like the extension of the Trump tax cuts. I mean, to me, the priority would be to get the full expensing with an increase to structures, right?
Yeah.
To
Yeah. I think that should be priority number one and done on a permanent basis. Because
yes,
if we're just in
permanent.
a world where it's like 2 or 3 years, that does not provide the certainty you need to actually make a big investment in the United States. If you don't know if that tax treatment's going to be around permanently, you don't know if your investment plan is viable on a permanent basis. So
Yeah.
if we really want to boost investment in the long run, you have to give businesses certainty that, hey, we're going to treat your investment the right way in the tax code permanently. That has like a growth dividend way above and beyond all of the other tax cuts that are being considered.
Yes.
So I think, yeah, it should be priority number one.
I say yes, but I know that because of you guys. Like, I say yes as if I come to that conclusion on my own. but yeah. No, I mean, I mean, it's made me kind of like, if I had to pick like one or two things, I would just say you just do that first. Maybe, I mean, I'd love to see the corporate income tax go to 15%. And,
Mm-hmm.
and then if that's all we get, that's all we get. I mean, that said, I would love to keep salt, but I don't think that if there's, I don't think that's all. I mean, but it just kind of, it seems to me that this is like, you want growth in this country, you want massive investment in this country, you want to make, America first or whatever the hell that means. That would be the priority.
Exactly. Yeah. It boosts those incentives for domestic investment. It helps in competition with China. It doesn't come with the drawbacks of a global trade war. So it should very obviously be the top of the list in terms of priorities for reconciliation and priorities for permanence.
Mm-hmm. And just I've seen like coming through my screen that Canada has made a deal with Trump, so the tariffs have been lifted for a month, but or paused for a month. But I mean, I actually want to ask you what you think of this idea of using tariffs as not a way to negotiate on trade deals, but on negotiate on things that have nothing to do with trade.
I think it's a big misstep. One of the, advantages of USMCA, of NAFTA before that, was the certainty that it gave trade in, the North American region. If we're just ripping that up, throwing that up in the air, saying, hey, maybe we will, maybe we won't tariff you, maybe we will, maybe we won't start a trade war because we want these other things. And in the case of Canada, the other things are quite unspecified. That moves us into a new era of like policy uncertainty that's going to undermine incentives to invest. Even if the tariffs aren't ultimately imposed, you can only make this type of threat so many times. And doing that throws into chaos all of what we thought knew was certain. And so, we have some papers from the first time around with Trump and his tariff threats. He made a similar threat against Mexico on the border his first time in office. And we have evidence that like that shrunk GDP and that shrunk investment, even though the tariffs never went into effect, just because of the uncertainty that it caused for businesses. I think it's even worse this time around, given that he did negotiate USMCA. It was, his trade deal, and now he's gone back on his word on that. So I think it's a terrible policy development. And it's not clear that like a crazy tariff threat is the only way to get something done on the border, to get something done on drug policy. It's very clearly not, the top of the list on the most efficient, the most economically helpful ways to get to agreements, even where there are legitimate issues that need to be worked on.
Now that I have you, I want to ask you this question. He has said when he was at Davos, he complained about the European VAT, and he talked about how that was unfair to American exports. Can you explain if you could talk to the president, why? I mean, I'm not a VAT supporter, but why he's absolutely wrong that the VAT is a penalty on American exports.
Yeah, the VAT is completely neutral. So if I live in France and I'm deciding, am I going to buy something that was produced in the US or am I going to buy something that was produced here? I will face the same VAT burden on that. It makes no distinction between whether the good I'm consuming was produced in my home country or whether it was produced abroad. So from a consumer standpoint, it does not create a penalty on an imported good versus a domestically produced good. And that's true across all VATs. That's just they are trade neutral. So there is no disadvantage to U.S. exports because other countries have taxes on consumption.
And it's worse. And they were also saying that the same is true when the Europeans send their goods to be sold in the U.S. They deduct their VAT, right?
Right, because a VAT is supposed to be a tax on domestic consumption.
Exactly.
So that's all it is. It's not creating a subsidy for exports from France. It's just neutral toward them because it is supposed to be a tax on consumption, and an export is not consumed in the domestic market, so it doesn't face that tax. These countries also have corporate income taxes that that are in play too, and so there really is no distortion created by a value-added tax.
And the reason, again, it's worth really repeating, it's because, yes, it is true that when a French company sends its products to America, we don't have a VAT. But all that matters in terms of fairness is a French product sold in America taxed the same way as an American product sold in America? That's the fairness comparison. And
exactly.
Yes,
and people are conceptually familiar with this. If you live in a state that has a sales tax, your state sales tax is not penalizing, like I live in Kansas. If I buy something at Walmart, if it was made in Georgia versus Kansas, I have I don't care. I am paying sales tax on it because I pay sales tax on anything that I purchase, whether it was made in a different state or whether it was made in my own state or whether it was made in another country. It's neutral with respect to that.
Yes. Well, Erica, that's all the time we have now, but I want to thank you because this is really useful, I think, for people to kind of wrap their heads around what's happening. And I really want, again, to recommend, just Google Erica York at the Tax Foundation, and you'll see there's enormous amount of things on tariffs and other things, but the Cato piece is called Separating Tariff Facts from Tariff Fictions, lots of F's that are hard and challenging for my French mouth. But nonetheless, it's a really excellent piece. It has tons of charts. It's very, very instructive. So thank you very much. And
thank you.
And I'm sure we're going to be, a lot of people are going to continue asking you to come and talk about tariff in these crazy times.
Yes, unfortunately, I think that's right.